Okay, I think we are now streaming live into Facebook, so hopefully you can all see and hear me. I'll just make sure that I'm off mute. Yes, that's good. And I will check that that is going live there. Fabulous. Okay, so good morning, happy Friday, wherever you are, or if you're listening on the replay. I hope today is an equally good day. I am coming to you this morning to continue to have, excuse me, my throat's been croaky this morning, have some discussion around behaviour. So last week, I shared with you a bit of my thoughts around the different models of understanding kids' behaviour. So today I want to go a bit deeper into that and see if we can unpack a bit more about what it means to look at children's behaviour and use that as a clue to ask us to be more curious and really try to understand what's happening underneath that behaviour. So often we can make assumptions, and we talked last time a bit about the behavioural model and what kind of assumptions that makes around children's behaviour. So I'm going to share with you a model that Mona Delahooke has put together very concisely in a really easy way in a number of her publications and a number of her works that will maybe help you to understand even further about what might be happening when we see a behaviour happening in a child. I suppose the most frustrating part of seeing kids' behaviour is that feeling of not knowing what to do or not knowing like why is it happening, and feeling like if we get an understanding of why it's happening, we can feel more comfortable and more confident to help that person. So this is going to give you a bit of a framework to be thinking about what could be the possible whys. But when we ask these kinds of questions and we look at children's behaviour in this way, the answers are in terms of what we can do as parents and carers and educators and people working with children and young people with maybe challenging or difficult behaviour, or behaviour that indicates there's something going on and something that they need some support with. It really starts to inform us in a really wonderful way. And it just really resonates with how I like to work and what I already understand and understood about child development, and particularly neurodivergent development in terms of those differences. So one thing to be thinking about is this idea that behaviour is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you understand, there's lots of graphics you can see around where we draw sometimes a visual representation of somebody's behaviour, a child's behaviour, an adolescent's behaviour, an adult's behaviour. It doesn't really matter. And we show the waterline, and the top of an iceberg is just what we can see if we were floating along on an ocean. But underneath an iceberg is a lot bigger. There's a lot more going under the waterline that we can't see. And so it's that part that we can't see that we want to be getting a better understanding of. Now, when we just look at that behavioural model where we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, we make assumptions, whether that's intentional, whether they're getting some sort of reward for that behaviour. And sometimes it can still be about there's an environmental trigger that's maybe caused the behaviour, but sometimes then that behavioural model still keeps going into processes of going, well, we'll just change the triggers, or we'll just change the environment, and we'll just reward the behaviour that we want to see, and hopefully that'll extinguish this behaviour that we don't want to see. And often I suppose what happens is these that model doesn't take into account all the stuff that's underneath the iceberg, all the internal kind of workings that are happening in a way that we can't see. So it's within a child's body, it's within a child's temperament, within a child's emotional and social development. So that's what we're going to talk a bit about today, about what is that under the surface stuff. So a really important part of it is this model is thinking about kids' nervous systems as being really important for driving different kind of behaviour. And also just those individual differences that exist between people, that and what that kind of looks like, what that unique person looks like in terms of their personality and the things they like or dislike, and also social emotional development. So the growth and the changes that children through to adolescents and young adults, through the processes that they go through in terms of maturing and developing different skills and abilities. Now, there's a whole lot of research around different stages and ages of development that children go through. And I suppose it's also just keeping in mind our realistic expectations around where are they in that process, is what we're seeing typical or atypical, depending on that kind of transformation that happens slowly, but also just understanding where they're at, regardless of age or ability, and meeting them where they're at. So I want to talk a little bit about, to begin with, the nervous system part of understanding what's happening for your child. So a lot of work when we think about children's behaviour, particularly if we're seeing anxious behaviour or explosive kind of angry behaviour from kids or teens, we start to think about what is happening to a person's nervous system when we're in those states. So I've done a lot of work with kids and coaching them and parents to be thinking about what's happening to your body when we're having that. So lots of people nowadays, it's really wonderful, are quite familiar with the fight or flight response, or some people call it the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So that kind of high energy response, we know it sort of originates from a part of the brain that is our survival instinct, our reptilian part of the brain, the original part of the brain when we were forming as human beings. And there's special parts of the brain, the amygdala being one of those parts of the brain that is responsible for being triggered into action, releasing lots of hormones and energy, which was really, really useful in those times when, if we didn't move fast into action, we were in real danger, in life and death kind of situations. So those triggers, the heart rate that increases, the muscles that are ready to go into action, whether it's to run away from a threat or whether it's to go into fighting a predator or another person or another thing, was real life and death kind of triggers that are a really important part of our evolutionary history, and we still have those mechanisms in our body today. So a lot of kids are familiar that those responses, those triggers can happen not necessarily because we're in life and death threat positions, but our bodies respond as though we are. So often people who have anxiety disorders tend to get their responses triggered in their brain, and they go into that reactivity. And until that adrenaline, which is one of the chemicals that gets triggered, kind of releases from the brain, they're having all these physical symptoms of wanting to either run away or run towards something very, very high energy. So the other thing that we know and lots of people can be familiar with is when we have that kind of fight-flight response, our thinking part of our brain, which is the front part of our brain, which evolved last and developed last in terms of evolution of our human brain. And when we are in that state of survival and reactivity, our planning thinking part of the brain is quite disconnected from the other parts of our brain. And we kind of talk about it like being taken over, or we're on autopilot, we're just sort of more reactive. Whereas when we're using that front part of our brain, we're being able to do more logical thinking and reasoning. So all that ability to do logical thinking and reasoning really depends on the age of the child as well, because we know that we're more reactive. Our brain wiring is still fusing things together to do things like logical reasoning. That doesn't happen until we're fully formed around 25 years of age. So that is a process all the way up to that. And we can still keep learning how to connect with that logical thinking part of our brain more easily, even as adults. So we never stop growing and changing in that way. But in terms of where your child or teenager is, those abilities to even be able to do logical reasoning and the likelihood that they'll be tripped into more reactive kind of responses could be quite likely depending on where they are just in their development. So the other part of our nervous system that's really important to be thinking about also is that it has this ability, we think that it has this ability to detect threat under our conscious awareness. So that is not just seeing something like a spider and kind of getting a real fright, and then we kind of link the two together, that we've become really, really scared or really, really angry because we saw a spider and it made us feel fearful. There could be things in our environment or things in your child or teenager's environment that their nervous system has detected as a threat to their well-being in some way, and has triggered one of those survival instinct responses. So when that happens, if we are to ask, you see some big behavior that comes from that explosion or an outburst or running away or hiding or withdrawing, if we were to ask them and go, what was that all about? Like, we were just sitting having a conversation, or nothing that we could see. If we're looking from that behavioral thing, what triggered this? Nothing seemed to be triggering it. And the young person themselves might say the same thing. I don't know. All of a sudden, I just had to get out of there, or I just felt, wow. That is because there's that ability for our nervous system to detect threat even under conscious awareness. So we as adults, if you've ever had that feeling where you get like that instinctual kind of like something doesn't feel right, that feeling in your gut, some people say, an uneasy feeling, that can be that neuroception, that something feels off. There's something being detected in our environment around us that is making us feel like we need to be on alert for whatever reason. And that sends messages obviously back to our nervous system saying, hey, you're not feeling too good. This is not safe at the moment. What do we need to do to get back safe again? And so it might trigger us into that fight or flight response. But there's also other kinds of nervous system responses that happen. So the Polyvagal Theory talks about having like a ladder, and that on that ladder we have our calm, regulated kind of state where we're able to engage, we're able to laugh, we're able to play, we're able to maybe talk if that's where we're at, but we're able to do back and forth, and we're feeling comfortable and we're not feeling threatened at all. When we feel or detect a threat or something does threaten us, we might move into that fight or flight response. Now, for others, over long periods of time, if we are experiencing threat and if we're experiencing unsafe kind of spaces for longer periods of time, they move into another space which may look like a shutdown kind of response. So you may see kids who they either look calm, but if we look closer at their behavior, they're actually not calm and engaged. They're actually shut down, withdrawn. And we see this kind of response often, I suppose, in kids who perhaps have been exposed to ongoing trauma or ongoing unsafe spaces, they're disconnected. And sometimes, you know, it could be something that eventually looks like a depression or looks like a disconnect from everything around. That again is still a response for our nervous system to shut down energy to save resources and save energy on kind of bunkering down until the threat passes. That's sort of the evolutionary understanding of when children's behaviour, teenagers, adults' behaviour moves into that space, that there is still ongoing threat that's being detected, and the fight or flight response perhaps has been activated, but it's been activated and activated and activated, and now it's still not safe. So you kind of have to go down into another state. So when we know that our nervous systems can respond in these ways, sometimes without our awareness, it helps us to be thinking about what might be happening for our child if we're seeing some of these sorts of responses from kids. And it makes us go, okay, there is unsafeness being detected somewhere, somehow, whether it's within the body, whether it's within the environment, whether it's within relationships, whatever it might be. So understanding that nervous system and understanding what those different kind of responses look like and how we can support them as well. So we'll be talking a bit more about how to pinpoint those different kind of nervous system responses in a bit more detail on another one of my talks. But for now, just be mindful that those different kind of presentations of behavior, the fight or flight and the shutdown and the calm, are quite different presentations. Obviously, they can be blended, which makes it more tricky, but we can kind of get good at observing, and then that can help us to kind of inform what we're going to do next. So the other thing to be thinking about is, with all of our individual differences, I think it's really, really important to think about the sensory system. So a lot of the work that I do is with neurodivergent young people and teenagers and adults. So if they're autistic or they have ADHD or they're dyslexic or have Tourette's disorder, they've got some sensory differences frequently. And so how they absorb and process information through their sensory system is going to be different. They have differences, whether it's sensitivities, whether it's a lack of synthesizing the information in a way that feels comfortable for them in their bodies. So thinking about that is really deeply connected to how they're going to respond from a behavioural perspective. So when we see behaviour and go, that's confusing, a really important thing to be thinking about is what might be happening from them from a sensory system perspective. And when we begin to do that, a lot more things begin to make sense. So really be thinking about, what does this person's sensory profile look like? What kind of things might trigger their different behaviours? Because again, if we've got an overload of sensory information, or we're overwhelmed by an environment that's filled with lots of sensory information, that also might trigger off those feelings of unsafeness. And so when we go into that environment and we have a sensory system that is, integrating everything okay, and, nothing seems too loud, nothing seems too hot, nothing seems too tight, feeling quite comfortable, our system's going to be going, okay, you're feeling good. Yep, you're good. We're in a classroom or you're in a workplace. Everything feels fine. That same, a person can walk into the same environment and be finding the lights are flickering, and or they can hear the lights as well, or there's some smells coming from the staff room or someone's school bag, and they're getting an overwhelm of sensory information into their body that they're having trouble filtering out, or they haven't got their ear defenders and their ears are having too much noise coming in, and that as well might be triggering very unsafe feelings in their body, and maybe not knowing how to regulate that or how to manage that. And so then what we might see is that tip of the iceberg. They might be running out of the classroom or hiding under a desk or shouting at everyone to be quiet or whatever it might be. we might see some behaviour that might sort of say, oh, that's disruptive, challenging behaviour, and, you know, say that's not okay, or you can't do that, or whatever it might be, without understanding all the things that have led to that point. So really keeping in mind someone's sensory profile, and because then we can do something about it, we can show some support, we can make accommodations, and people as well can learn about their own nervous system and their own sensory system as well, and how those two are connected to different behaviour as well. So the other thing, really important part of it, of course, is thinking about our emotions and thinking about our thoughts. So those things as well can trigger different responses from our own bodies and different behaviour as well. So, and they're going to be connected to people's experiences. So everyone has their own histories, they have their own experiences with memories that they carry with us each and every day. So those things also make up really important tapestry, I suppose, of understanding behaviour. And we can't just look at behaviour without really considering that context and about how that leads down a certain path, or it makes us move in a certain bias. So yeah, thinking about the nervous system, all the individual differences that happen, our sensory system, where we are in our social emotional development, and also thinking about just our physical system as well. So our sensory system is part of that too, but in terms of thinking about how rested a child or young person might be, how much food, what their glucose levels are like in terms of how often they've eaten or how long since they've eaten, thinking about how much water is going into their bodies. Are they able to kind of be drinking regularly so that they're not dehydrated, those kinds of things. Are they able to go to the toilet? You know, do they know when to go to the toilet so that they're comfortable within their body as well? So certainly thinking about all those things, because that can cause, of course, great discomfort if things like sleep are not happening, or food at the right time is not happening, or drink at the right time is not happening, and going to the toilet is not happening as well. So those basic kind of physical needs have to be met as well if we want to be really looking at what is happening when we're trying to understand kids and teens' behaviour. So that's a bit of an overview of the kinds of things that I want you to be thinking about when we're looking below the surface at understanding kids' behaviour better. Because I think when we do that, it leads us, like I said at the beginning, it leads us to a lot of really wonderful adaptations and ways that we can respond to support them with their behaviour. So I'm just going to check and see if there are any questions if somebody is with me live. I can't see anybody on here at the moment, but like I say, always, if you are watching this later on, if you have a question about a specific kind of behaviour or something else that's come up while I've been talking, certainly pop it in the comments box, and I will come back to you and do my best to answer that. I think that this viewpoint really helps us to be really compassionate about kids' behaviour, and we're going to talk a little bit more about I suppose some of the prerequisites and being able to respond really well to kids' behaviour. But certainly this viewpoint, I think, sheds a lot of light. It makes a lot of sense in terms of you know, working in this space, in terms of being able to support kids in a really holistic kind of way. So we're looking at the biology, we're looking at their development, we're looking at those individual differences, and we're looking at it like in a way that can be really good for in the moment. So one of the things, I suppose, you know, as parents and caregivers, is getting trained at seeing those beginnings of moving into a state of sort of dysregulation, or a state of kids trying to regulate themselves when something is uncomfortable for them, when, again, it's when they often feel that threat, and when they begin to move into that space of trying to make their nervous system feel safe again. And that's often the behaviours that we see. They're often the unsettled behaviours, or maybe their bodies become a bit more jerky, or their volume becomes a bit louder or a bit sharper. So as soon as we kind of recognize that they're the cues that they're not feeling safe, that their nervous system is sending some messages saying, hey, this doesn't feel very good, you need to start doing something about it, they're kind of already moving into that kind of arousal, into that fight flight stage. Doesn't mean they're going to go straight up there, but I know them from talking with parents and things that it really feels like there's kids that go from looking really well regulated into that fight or flight without apparently any warning at all, without any trigger, and they're going from one to the other really, really fast. So when that happens, and that's kind of like, feels like a real conundrum, it feels like it's like this out of the blue thing, what I suggest we do is we get really good at beginning to look at those cues of when we're in that super calm state, that happy, relaxed state. And Mona calls that the green pathway, when we're kind of connecting and being social and we're laughing, or we're just feeling comfortable, you know, looking comfortable in their skin, getting really good at noticing when those times are. So what kind of activities, what kind of people are they with when they're like that, and then doing the same for sort of going, when they looking uncomfortable, when does the challenging behavior happen, and kind of getting your observation on, getting really, really good at noticing what is happening with their body, what is happening with their tone of voice, what is happening with their movement, what is happening with their eye gaze and their ability to kind of interact, what is happening to their volume. You will see a change in those things. So they usually become either louder, jerkier, sharper in some way. There's like losing that fluidity, but it might become louder and bigger, more abrupt or sharp movements might happen with the body. Movement is a pretty big clue that something is happening to the nervous system, and so is volume for a lot of people as well. And again, that volume can increase because there's excitement, you know, it can be that like that bursting of like, oh my God, I'm so excited, but we get louder and we get kind of bigger with our arm movements maybe, but obviously the facial expression might be different. So you know, you have to, again, those individual differences in terms of knowing your child, because you know, just when we think about someone being in the in the calm pathway, it doesn't mean there's always going to be smiles on people's faces, because some people just aren't smiley, you know, or don't express it in that way. Same for when someone's in the fight or flight or beginning to move into that space. They're not just necessarily going to be gritting teeth and doing frowns and that kind of thing. So that's why whilst for some they do, for some you can kind of say, okay, yeah, the facial expression changed as well, but particularly with a neurodivergent, I wouldn't be resting solely on that, because we know there can be differences with that outward expression in terms of those traditional kind of senses of about what does certain emotions look like on different people. So be thinking though around the body kind of clues more, because that's more kind of connected to what we understand about nervous systems, which you know, in terms of human nervous systems. So but again, you know, it's about those individual kids. So your child, it's about getting to know your child and kind of getting to know what do they look like through those different kind of pathways. So and again, if they're in that shutdown kind of, if your child's ever been in that shutdown, what does that look like? What happens to their tone? What happens to their body language? What happens to their movement? What happens to sort of the energy that's happening there? So once we've done that and we get a good idea about what their nervous system might look like in different stages, then we can have a better chance of maybe interrupting some of those fast climbs. We can provide some safe regulation, because that is what's going to be very helpful for most kids. But we've also got to be looking at in terms of the strategies or the support that we're putting in, is it appropriate for where they are in their social emotional development, and have they got the capacity to put that in kind of independently? Are we asking them to take some things on that they can't do on their own? And so then it goes, okay, we actually need to come back to co-regulation. And that is where I'm going to leave it, because we're going to talk more about how we do that co-regulation, what that looks like, and a bit more about that next Friday. So I hope that's been helpful, useful, and got some ideas going for you. I'm just, again, I can't see any comments on there, whether that's because no one's here or whether it's just that Facebook's not showing them to me at the moment. But if you have any questions, please pop them in and I will definitely do my best to get back to you. And if you've got any other questions that you specifically want me to cover next Friday, more than happy to hear them as well. So before I finish off today, I also just want to say that I've got a group starting for parents who are either on a wait list for a neurodevelopmental assessment, or perhaps they've had that assessment and now they're waiting for some support. Maybe they're on wait lists for therapists or things like that. If you are a parent that is in that position and perhaps is newer to understanding about neurodivergencies like autism in particular, please check out my program Glimmer that will be starting very soon, and just know that there is support here. I don't ever want people to feel alone and overwhelmed at the beginning of that journey. So that is my goal, to bring parents together and work through some information in a way that's helpful but not overwhelming. So I'll put the link in after this video, but please, yeah, check it out or pass it to someone that you know that could use the support. I'm going to leave it there. So I hope everybody has an amazing Friday, an amazing weekend ahead, and I will look forward to catching up with you again very soon. Take care.